There is a photograph taken on the 17th of April, 2021, that most people saw and then looked away from, because it was too private to look at directly. It was taken at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, had died 4 days earlier at the age of 99. The chapel could hold 800 people. COVID restrictions meant that only 30 were permitted inside for the funeral. 30 people in a chapel built for 1,000, saying goodbye to a man who had been at the center of this woman's life for 73 years. She sat alone. Not alone in the chapel, there were 30 people present, her children, her grandchildren, carefully arranged in small groups at a distance from each other. But she sat alone in her pew. A small figure in black, her face covered by a mask, her hands folded in her lap, watching the coffin of the man she had married in 1947 make its way down the aisle without her beside it. Protocol required the separation. Protocol always required something. The mask meant you could not see her face clearly, but the posture said everything that the mask concealed. The set of her shoulders, the particular stillness of a woman who has spent 70 years learning how to be still when stillness is the only acceptable option. She was 94 years old. She had been queen for 69 of those years. She had buried her father, her mother, her sister, her friends, her prime ministers, her era. She had watched the world she was born into dissolve and been required to dissolve with it gracefully, always in service of an institution that asked for everything and returned to her, in that pew, precisely what it had always returned to her: the appearance of composure. The performance of endurance. The duty performed alone. She died 17 months later on the 8th of September 2022 at Balmoral Castle in Scotland, the place she loved most, which was also, and this matters, the place where the institution required her least, where she could breathe. Where she was, as much as she was ever permitted to be, simply herself. She had reigned for 70 years and 214 days. It was the longest reign in British history. In that time she had met 15 presidents of the United States, 15 prime ministers of the United Kingdom, and heads of state from nearly every nation on earth. She had delivered 70 Christmas broadcasts, opened Parliament 67 times, sent hundreds of thousands of telegrams to centenarians whose name she would never know. She had not, in all of that time, been permitted to simply grieve. This is the story of what that cost. And of the moments, rare, private, carefully hidden from the cameras, when the cost became visible anyway. The firm and its requirements. London, 1,000 years. The British monarchy is the oldest continuously functioning institution in the Western world. This is its boast, its justification, and its most demanding requirement of the human beings who inhabit it. To endure for 1,000 years, an institution must become more important than the people inside it. The crown must matter more than the monarch. The continuity must matter more than the comfort of whoever is maintaining it in any given generation. The institution does not ask this explicitly. It does not need to. The asking is built into every protocol, every ceremony, every arrangement of space and time and language that surrounds the people who carry the title. They learn it before they can read. By the time they understand what has been asked of them, it has already been given. The assets that underpin this institution are extraordinary in scale. The Crown Estate, the vast portfolio of land, property and seabed rights that belongs to the Crown in constitutional arrangement with the government, was valued at approximately £15, £6 billion in 2022. The Duchy of Lancaster, which provides the sovereign's private income, generates over £20 million annually. Sandringham House in Norfolk, a private estate purchased by Edward VII in 1862, is worth over £50 million and belongs not to the Crown but to the monarch personally. Balmoral Castle in Aberdeenshire, purchased by Prince Albert in 1852, is worth a comparable amount and is also personally owned, passed from sovereign to sovereign outside the formal constitutional arrangements. The crown jewels, the imperial state crown, the sovereign's orb, the sovereign's scepter, the objects that have been used in coronations since the 12th century, are not insured because no insurance figure has ever been agreed upon. They are, in the relevant sense, priceless. The royal collection, the artworks, the furniture, the objects accumulated across 5 centuries of royal acquisition, is held in trust for the nation and valued, to the extent it has been valued, at tens of billions. All of this wealth, all of this accumulation, all of this weight of history and property and obligation, passes from monarch to monarch as a condition of the role. It cannot be refused, it cannot be selected from. You take it all, or you abdicate, and the abdication of Edward VII in 1936, when Elizabeth was 10 years old, had made clear what abdication cost. Not just the person who abdicates but everyone around them. The monarchy nearly did not survive 1936. The family that absorbed the consequences of that abdication understood, as few families in history have understood it, what the institution required in exchange for its survival. It required everything, and it required it without complaint. The girl who became a queen, London, 1926–1952. Elizabeth Alexandra Mary Windsor was born on the 21st of April 1926, in a house on Bruton Street in Mayfair, the first child of the Duke and Duchess of York. Her father was the second son of King George V, a quiet, serious man with a stammer that had required years of professional help to manage, who had neither expected nor prepared for the kingship that would eventually fall to him, and who would become, in the opinion of most historians, one of the finest kings in the history of the institution. Her mother was Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, a Scottish aristocrat of formidable will and social intelligence, who would outlive almost everyone she loved, survive a world war and a monarchy crisis, and the death of her husband by 50 years. And reach the age of 101 with a public image so carefully maintained that it constituted one of the great performances of the 20th century. Elizabeth grew up in this family as its golden child, adored by both parents, adored by her grandfather George V, who called her Lilibet in the particular compression of language that affection generates, and a nickname that would stick for 96 years. She was photographed from infancy. She was admired. She was, in the specific way of beloved royal children, simultaneously overprotected and completely unprepared for what was coming. She was 10 years old when her uncle Edward VII abdicated to marry Wallis Simpson. The abdication was, for the child watching from inside the family, a catastrophe that had nothing to do with constitutions or morganatic marriage or the public arguments about duty and love that filled the newspapers. What it meant for 10-year-old Elizabeth was that her father, the quiet man with the stammer who had never wanted to be king, was now king, and that what had been her childhood, contained and loved and relatively normal by royal standards, was now over. Her father was transformed by the kingship in the way that the kingship transforms. He became more serious, more burdened, more absent in the way that kings are absent, physically present, but institutionally elsewhere, thinking always about the next obligation, the next ceremony. The next representation of the crown to a world that was by 1936 lurching toward a second catastrophic war within a generation. Elizabeth watched her father become an institution. She watched what it cost him. She was watching from very close range, and she was old enough to understand some of it, and what she understood was the lesson that would shape the next 70 years of her life, that the crown takes everything personal and transforms it into public. That there is no grief that remains private when you wear that weight, and that the only defense against that transformation, the only way to maintain any interior life at all, is to keep it absolutely, completely hidden. She was 13 years old when the war began. She was 14 when she made her first radio broadcast, a message to the children of the Commonwealth who had been evacuated from their homes, speaking in a voice that was controlled and warm and already at 14 entirely composed. She was 18 when she joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service, driving and maintaining vehicles, the first female member of the royal family to serve in the armed forces. She was 21 when she made the speech on her birthday that would define her reign 50 years before it began. She was speaking from South Africa in a broadcast to the Commonwealth. She had met Philip of Greece and Denmark 4 years earlier, when he was a cadet at the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth, and she was a 13-year-old visiting with her parents. She had been in love with him, in the particular, determined, unironic way of certain people who know their own minds very young ever since. On her 21st birthday, with the world still rebuilding from the ruins of a war that had killed 60 million people, she said this: "I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong." She meant it. She meant every word of it. She was 21 years old, and she had already decided, in the specific way that some people of extraordinary character decide things, that what she felt personally was secondary to what she owed publicly. She had watched her father make this same decision. She had watched it cost him everything but his dignity. She had decided that his dignity was worth the cost. She married Philip on the 20th of November 1947 at Westminster Abbey. She was 21, he was 26. The wedding was watched by 200 million people on radio. She wore a dress of ivory Duchess satin embroidered with garlands of white York roses, designed by Norman Hartnell, sewn by a team of seamstresses who had saved their clothing ration coupons for months, so the materials could be procured. The photographs of her on her wedding day show a woman radiant in a way she would rarely permit herself to appear in public again, not performing radiance. Actually experiencing it too fully to entirely manage, the joy leaking out around the edges of the composed face she was already learning to maintain. She was queen in training. She was also unmistakably in love. February 6, 1952, the morning she became a different person. She was 25 years old. She and Philip were in Kenya, at Treetops, a game observation lodge built in the branches of an enormous fig tree overlooking a watering hole. They had gone there to watch the wildlife. It was the kind of trip that would have been ordinary for a young married couple of means, beautiful, adventurous, far from obligation. For Elizabeth, already the heir presumptive, it was the last ordinary thing she would ever do. Her father, King George VI, had died in his sleep in the early hours of the 6th of February 1952 at Sandringham House. He was 56 years old. He had been ill for years, the strain of the war. The decades of smoking that had damaged his lungs severely enough to require surgery in 1951, the weight of a kingship he had not wanted and had carried with absolute dedication, had accumulated into a body that simply stopped. She did not know immediately. The news reached the party in Kenya through the complicated transmission of information across thousands of miles in 1952, when communication was cables and radio signals and the carefully managed protocols of official notification. Philip was told by his equerry Mike Parker. He walked to where his wife was standing and said 4 words, the account of which has passed through the family's oral history into the record. She understood immediately. She asked for a moment alone. She was 25 years old. She had just lost her father. She would not see his body. She would not be at his bedside. She was 10,000 miles away in a tree house in Kenya, and the world she had been inhabiting for 25 years had just ended, and a different world had begun. Those who were with her that day have described what they saw in the minutes after she received the news. They have described consistently that they saw almost nothing, that she walked away from the group, stood alone for a short time, and then returned and was composed. Completely, utterly composed, that she began immediately discussing the practical arrangements, the flight home, the notifications that would need to be made, the schedule that would now need to be restructured entirely forever. She was performing the suppression that she had been practicing for 25 years. She was performing it so well in the most devastating moment of her young life that the people standing next to her could only see the surface. She gave them nothing else to see. She flew home. She landed at London Airport. She was met by prime ministers and officials and the apparatus of the state she now headed. She descended from the plane in blacks. Someone had ensured she had mourning clothes. The planning for this day had been ongoing. The illness of her father had meant preparations were made, and she walked across the tarmac and she was the queen. She was 25 years old. She would hold this title for 70 years and 214 days. She would hold it through the loss of everyone she had loved. She would hold it without putting it down, without taking a day off from the weight of it, without ever once permitting herself the public luxury of not being equal to it. The private story is different, always different. But it would take decades for any of it to become visible, and only in the moments when the institution, for once, could not contain what it was holding. Philip, the man who made it possible. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, is one of the most misunderstood figures in the history of the British royal family, which is a competitive category. The public image, the gaffes, the bluntness. The difficult humour that did not always translate across the distances of public life, obscured something that those who knew him well and those who have studied him seriously consistently describe, that he was a man of formidable intelligence, genuine originality, and an extraordinary personal sacrifice that has never been fully reckoned with. He gave up his career. He had been a naval officer of real distinction. His commanding officers during the war had written of him as one of the finest officers they had served with, composed under fire, decisive, capable of inspiring men in circumstances that would have broken lesser character. He loved the Navy in the way that some people love the thing they are genuinely built for. When Elizabeth became queen, he resigned his commission. He never went back, he gave up his name. The royal family's surname had been Windsor since 1917, when George V changed it from Saxe-Coburg and Gotha during the First World War. Philip's family name was Mountbatten. There was a moment early in the reign when it was proposed that the family name might change to Mountbatten-Windsor, a recognition of his contribution, a symbolic inclusion. The establishment resisted. The name remained Windsor. He remained in the nomenclature of the dynasty secondary. He gave up his authority. The protocol of the monarchy placed him always one step behind his wife. He walked behind her at every formal occasion. He bowed to her. He called her privately in the moments when no one could hear Lilibet. In public he was the Duke. In private he was the only person in the world who was permitted to speak to her as a person, and not as an institution. The only one who could tell her she was wrong. The only one who could make her laugh in the way that people laugh when they are genuinely amused rather than performing amusement. Those who worked closely with both of them describe the relationship with a consistency that speaks to something genuine, that the Queen was, in Philip's presence, different. More relaxed, more likely to say what she actually thought, more likely to laugh, that he occupied a space in her life that no one else could occupy because no one else had agreed to what he had agreed to subordinate himself entirely to the institution she embodied. For 54 years of public life in exchange for nothing more than being beside her, she gave him the Garter, the Thistle, the Order of Merit, the highest honors within her power to give. She gave them publicly, formally, in the language of the institution. What she could not give him publicly was what she felt privately, because the institution did not have language for that. The institution had language for service and duty and honor, not for love. They were married for 73 years. He died on the 9th of April 2021. She sat alone in his funeral pew 4 days later with her hands folded in her lap, and the mask covered her face, and the institution got what it always got from her, the composure, the performance of endurance. What it cost her, the specific, physical interior cost of sitting alone in that pew and not falling apart, is something that no one who was not her can know. But those who were with her in the weeks after Philip's death have said that she was quieter than they had ever seen her, that she moved more slowly, that she seemed, for the first time in anyone's professional memory, something close to lost. She was 94 years old and she had been beside him for 73 years, and now the pew was empty. She gave him one thing publicly. During his funeral service, the Dean of Windsor read a poem that Philip had chosen himself. It was not a well-known poem. It was a text from the bidding prayer, and it contained the line, "We give back to you, O God, those whom you gave to us." He had chosen it, she had approved it. It was the nearest either of them ever came, in the public record, to speaking about what the other one meant. Margaret, the life that was forbidden. If Elizabeth was the crown's success story, the daughter who absorbed the lesson of duty and gave herself to it completely, her sister Margaret was the counterpoint. The demonstration, conducted across an entire lifetime, of what the institution cost when you could not or would not pay the full price. Margaret Rose Windsor was born on the 21st of August, 1930, 4 years after her sister, the second daughter of the Duke and Duchess of York, the spare to Elizabeth's heir. She was beautiful in the way that immediately distinguishes beauty from its approximations. Dark-haired, violet-eyed, possessed of a wit and a theatrical quality that her more contained sister was not. Those who knew both of them have described the dynamic consistently. Elizabeth was the responsible one, Margaret was the compelling one. Elizabeth ran the household, Margaret lit up the room. She fell in love in the early 1950s with Group Captain Peter Townsend. He was the king's equerry, her father's equerry, then her mother's. He was 16 years older than Margaret. He was also divorced, which in 1952 and 1953 was the relevant fact, the insurmountable one. The Church of England, of which Elizabeth was the supreme governor, did not permit divorced persons to remarry in church. The establishment, the government, the church, the machinery of the crown, concluded that if Margaret married Townsend, she would have to renounce her rights of succession and her civil list income. Elizabeth was the queen. She was also Margaret's sister. She was 27 years old and she had been queen for 2 years, and she was still learning the weight of the crown and what it required of her. What it required of her in this case was that she not intervene on her sister's behalf. Not officially. Not in the way that would have mattered. Margaret waited. She loved Townshend for 2 years while the establishment decided what to do with the situation. She was photographed with him, and the photographs published with the kind of ferocity that suggested the press already knew what was happening. In 1955, when she turned 25 and was no longer legally required to seek the Queen's permission to marry, she could have simply done it. She could have accepted the consequences and chosen the man. She did not. She issued a statement on the 31st of October 1955, saying that she had decided not to marry Group Captain Townshend, mindful of the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble. She said she had been guided principally by a sense of duty. Whether she made this decision herself, whether she was guided toward it, whether Elizabeth could have done more to prevent it, these questions have been discussed for 70 years and will continue to be discussed. What is not discussed enough is what the decision cost Margaret. Not immediately in the headlines and the sympathy of the public, but across the decades that followed. She married Anthony Armstrong-Jones, later Lord Snowdon, in 1960. He was a photographer, brilliant and unconventional, and eventually, by most accounts, unfaithful. They had 2 children, David and Sarah. They divorced in 1978, the first royal divorce in the British family's modern history. She had relationships after Snowdon, most notably with Roddy Llewellyn, 17 years her junior, a relationship that continued for nearly a decade, and that the press covered with a cruelty calibrated to the particular relish reserved for people who have been elevated and are now seen to be falling. She drank, she smoked heavily in the way that some people smoke when smoking is the only dependable pleasure available. She suffered a series of strokes in the late 1990s. She lost the use of her legs. She lost partial sight and partial hearing. She died on the 9th of February 2002 at the King Edward VII Hospital in London of a stroke suffered in her bath. She was 71 years old. Elizabeth was 75. She had been queen for 50 years. She had watched her sister's life unspool across those 50 years. The choices made, the choices not made, the costs of both, from the particular distance imposed by her position. She could not be simply a sister. She was also the crown, and the crown had requirements that had shaped the choices available to Margaret, and the choices not available to her. Whether she ever allowed herself to grieve for Margaret the way a sister grieves, not a queen, not a monarch, but a woman who had grown up sharing secrets with another small girl in wartime London, is not something the record shows. What the record shows is that 6 weeks after Margaret's death, Elizabeth's mother died as well. The Queen Mother, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, died on the 30th of March 2002 at Royal Lodge, Windsor, aged 101. Elizabeth buried her sister and her mother within 6 weeks of each other. She was 75 years old. The institution required her to continue. She continued. Diana, the moment the mask almost slipped on the 31st of August 1997, Diana Spencer died in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris. She was 36 years old. She had been divorced from the Prince of Wales for a year. She was no longer a member of the royal family in any formal sense. She was, in the constitutional arrangements, a private citizen. The public did not treat it as a private matter. What followed her death was one of the most extraordinary events in modern British history, a collective outpouring of public grief that surprised everyone, including the people who were supposed to be managing it. Flowers appeared outside Kensington Palace in quantities that built into drifts and eventually mountains. People who had never met her came from across the country and across the world to stand in queues that lasted hours, to sign books of condolence, to leave soft toys and cards and notes addressed to a woman they had watched on television and felt they knew. The royal family was at Balmoral. They had gone there as they always went there in August for the summer. William and Harry were with their father. The Queen and Philip were there. The institution began, immediately, managing the situation in the way it managed situations. Carefully, with attention to protocol, with the particular slowness of a bureaucracy designed to be stable rather than responsive. The flag above Buckingham Palace was not lowered to half-mast. This was correct by protocol. The only flag flown there is the royal standard, which represents the sovereign. and it flies at full mast except when the sovereign is not in residence. But the public, which did not know the protocol and was not in a mood to care about it, saw the flag at full mast and experienced it as a message, as indifference, as the institution failing to feel what it should feel. The public feeling curdled into something that had not been seen in Britain in modern times, a genuine, organised public anger directed at the royal family. At the Queen, tabloid headlines asked where she was, why she hadn't returned to London, why she wasn't saying anything. The ground felt, to those who were watching closely, genuinely unstable in a way it had not felt since 1936. Elizabeth came back. She addressed the nation, live on television, on the 5th of September 1997, the day before the funeral. She had not done this. She did not do things like this. The monarch did not make personal statements about her feelings on the death of a former daughter-in-law. The protocol did not exist because the situation had not existed. She spoke. She said, "I for one believe there are lessons to be drawn from her life and from the extraordinary and moving reaction to her death." She said, "I want to pay tribute to Diana myself. She was an exceptional and gifted human being. In good times and bad, she never lost her capacity to smile and laugh, nor to inspire others with her warmth and kindness." She said at the end, "I hope that tomorrow we can all, wherever we join together in expressing our grief at Diana's loss, and gratitude for her all-too-short life. It is a chance to show to the whole world the British nation united in grief and respect." She was speaking from Buckingham Palace. Through the window behind her you could see the crowds and the flowers. She was speaking live. She was 71 years old and she was speaking on live television about her feelings, in a way she had never done and would never do again. Those who worked with her at the time, in the accounts given years later, have described the process of arriving at the speech. The resistance, the argument conducted at levels below the Queen about whether the speech was necessary and what it should contain. The eventual conclusion that the alternative, continued silence, continued distance, was no longer viable. The institution had read the situation correctly at last, that what was required was not protocol but humanity, and that the person best positioned to provide it was the woman who had been suppressing her humanity in service of the institution for 45 years. She walked to the window before the broadcast. She looked at the flowers. Those who were with her did not describe what her face showed. They described the silence, and then she turned back and gave the speech. The crowd outside the palace cheered when they saw her. The ground stabilized. The institution survived as it always survived, and the human being inside it walked back inside and did not speak of it again. The private escapes, Balmoral, the dogs, the horses. To understand what 70 years of public suppression required, you have to understand where it was released, because it was released somewhere. It had to be. No human organism can sustain that level of compression without finding outlets. The outlets were known, if not always recognized for what they were. Balmoral was the largest one. The estate in Aberdeenshire, purchased by Prince Albert in 1852 and cherished by every monarch since, was the one place in the Queen's life where the protocols were reduced to their minimum, where the press was not permitted, where the schedule belonged to her rather than to the institution. She arrived there every August and stayed through October, and those who worked with her at Balmoral have described a different person from the one who sat in weekly audiences with prime ministers at Buckingham Palace. More talkative, more likely to laugh. More likely to appear without warning in the kitchen, and make conversation with the staff in the way she could not make conversation in official contexts without it becoming an event. She drove herself at Balmoral. This detail appears consistently in accounts of her private life, and consistently surprises people who encounter it. She drove Land Rovers across the estate, often without security, and often at speeds that made the security detail anxious. She knew the land as she knew almost nothing else, its particular quality of light in late summer, the routes the deer took at dusk, the places on the River Dee where the salmon ran. She had walked this land since she was a child. It was, more than anywhere else on earth, where she was from. The corgis are part of the legend to the point where they have become a shorthand. The corgis at Balmoral, the corgis at Windsor, the corgis at Buckingham Palace. The specific comic dignity of small dogs trailing behind one of the most powerful women in the world across the polished floors of a palace. But the corgis were not a performance. She had kept them since she was 18 years old. She bred them. She knew their temperaments and their histories and their preferences in the way that people who love animals know these things. At the end of her life, when age and infirmity had prevented her from getting new dogs, the concern being that she might not outlast them, her son Andrew gave her 2 new puppies. She named them Muick and Sandy. She was 95 years old, and she had just buried her husband of 73 years, and someone gave her puppies and she named them. The horses were the other world. She had ridden since childhood, maintained an active interest in racing and breeding throughout her reign, attended Royal Ascot every year with a consistent pleasure that was one of the few public pleasures she permitted herself to display without management. She understood bloodlines, race records, form. She was, in the opinion of people who work in racing, genuinely expert in a field she could easily have been merely performatively interested in. These were the cracks in the surface through which the person inside was visible. The woman who drove too fast and knew the deer trails, and named the puppies and read the form guide, and laughed at Balmoral in a way she didn't laugh in London. The woman who had decided at 21 that her whole life would be devoted to service, and who had meant it, and who had paid for it with 70 years of compression, and who found in these small private worlds the minimum necessary to keep going. It was not enough by the standard of what a human life might reasonably contain. It was what the institution allowed. She took what was allowed and made of it what she could. The final years, 2021-2022. The last 2 years of Queen Elizabeth's life are a study in what it looks like when the body begins to fail while the will has not. Philip died in April 2021. She was 94. The image of her sitting alone in the pew in the black coat and mask became the image of the period, not because it was the most dramatic, but because it was the most honest. It showed what 70 years of service actually cost at the end. A woman alone in a pew, absorbing the loss of the only person who had been permitted to see her as a person. In the months after Philip's death, she began using a walking stick in public, which was itself a kind of statement. She had resisted using one, not for vanity, those who knew her have said, but because using a walking stick was a visible acknowledgement of limitation, and visible acknowledgement of limitation was not something the institution had trained her toward. The stick appeared, she used it. She was 95 years old and her husband was gone, and she was finding, as some people find after decades of sustained effort, that the effort was increasingly difficult to maintain at the same level. She continued. She opened Parliament. She received Prime Ministers. She gave the Christmas broadcast. She met the incoming Prime Minister Boris Johnson, the outgoing Theresa May, the outgoing Boris Johnson, the incoming Liz Truss. This last meeting on the 6th of September 2022 at Balmoral 2 days before her death, in which photographs show her standing to receive Truss with her hands visibly bruised and discoloured in ways that those who saw the photographs recognised as concerning. She was 96 years old. She had been queen for 70 years. She was standing in the drawing room of Balmoral to receive her 15th Prime Minister, and her hands showed what the rest of her face had been trained for a lifetime not to show. She died 2 days later, the 8th of September 2022, Balmoral Castle. Her children and some of her grandchildren had come. Charles was there, and Anne and Andrew and Edward. William arrived in time. Harry arrived after. She died in the afternoon with members of her family present in the place she loved most. The announcement was made at 6:30 p.m. British Summer Time. The BBC interrupted its programming. Buckingham Palace issued a statement. The statement was brief, formal, correct in every particular. The King, Charles, her son, now King, issued a longer statement later. He said, "We mourn profoundly the passing of a cherished sovereign and a much-loved mother. I know her loss will be deeply felt throughout the country, the realms and the Commonwealth, and by countless people around the world." He said, "During the lifetime of the Queen, I have been aware of this solemn and weighty responsibility, and I now assume this responsibility." The baton had passed. The institution continued. It always continues, what she never said. There is a list, if you compile it across the decades, of things Queen Elizabeth II never said in public. She never said she was tired. She never said she was sad, except in the most formal and managed constructions, expressions of deep sadness at disasters, at deaths, at catastrophes, all of them calibrated and appropriate and empty of the specific content that would have made them personal. She never said she was lonely. though she spent the final 17 months of her life without the person who had been beside her for 73 years. She never said she was frightened, though she was 25 years old when the weight of the British Empire descended on her in a game lodge in Kenya and required her to be equal to it immediately. She never said she was angry, though she had abundant reasons across 70 years, and the people who knew her best have described, in careful language, the particular quality of her silence when she was displeased, a silence more effective than any shouting. She never said she missed Philip after he was gone, though those who were with her in the months following his death have said she seemed smaller, that the bearing that had defined her for 94 years seemed, for the first time, to require effort. She never said it was too much, not once, not in 70 years. What she said at 21 was that her whole life would be devoted to service. And she spent 70 years proving that she had meant it, at a cost that the institution she served never fully acknowledged, because acknowledging it would have required the institution to examine what it had asked, and institutions are not built for examination. They are built for continuation, she continued. She was extraordinary at continuing. She was perhaps the finest exemplar in modern history of what it looks like when a human being makes an absolute commitment to something outside themselves, and keeps it, without deviation, across an entire lifetime. The qualities that produce this, the self-discipline, the sense of duty, the genuine conviction that service was the point of the role, are qualities that any serious account must treat with respect. But the list of what she never said is also a kind of ledger. A record of what the institution collected across 70 years and what it gave nothing back for. She gave it her young adulthood, she gave it her privacy, she gave it her relationship with her children who grew up with a mother who was also a crown, who could not always tell the difference between the two, who needed sometimes to be simply someone's mother, and found that the institution required her to be the queen first and everything else second. She gave it the grief for Philip, contained behind a mask in a pew where she sat alone. She gave it the grief for Margaret, absorbed in the weeks of continued duty that followed her sister's death. She gave it the grief for Diana, extracted from her in a live television broadcast that she had resisted and that the institution had required, and that remains in its combination of humanity and management, one of the most carefully constructed performances of grief in the history of modern public life. She gave all of it. For 70 years, without complaint, without, as far as the record shows, ever once holding back anything that was owed, the long lesson. There is a conversation that Queen Elizabeth II had with the writer Robert Lacey, who spent decades researching the royal family and was given unusual access across the years. He has recounted in various forms the texture of those conversations, the Queen's willingness to discuss history, to engage with the record, to be analytical about the institution she embodied with a clarity that was not always available to those inside it, who had not had 70 years to observe its workings. He has described her, in these conversations, as someone who understood exactly what she had agreed to and had no regrets about having agreed to it. Who believed, in the very precise way that people of genuine conviction believe things, that the institution mattered and that the cost of sustaining it was a legitimate cost. Who did not feel, as far as he could determine, that she had sacrificed herself. Who felt instead that she had fulfilled herself, that the devotion to service she had pledged at 21 was the thing she had been designed for, and that having done it for 70 years she had, in fact, done what she was for. This is a way of understanding her life that is worth taking seriously, not as a sad story, though it contains sadness, not as a story of suppression, though it contains suppression, but as the story of a person who found, in an extraordinary duty, an extraordinary meaning, and who paid the price that extraordinary duty always extracts, and who did not regret the paying. Whether the institution deserved what it received from her is a different question. Whether the people around her, Philip, who gave up everything to walk behind her, Margaret, who gave up the man she loved to the institution's requirements. The children who grew up with a crown for a mother, received adequate compensation for what was asked of them, is a different question. Whether the institution itself, which will continue beyond everyone who served it in her generation, merited the level of human sacrifice that its continuity has historically required, is the largest question of all, and not one that the institution invites. She did not invite it either. She gave it what it asked, and she asked nothing back, and she died in the place she loved best in the autumn of the year she turned 96 after the longest reign in British history. She had kept her word, that is not a small thing. In a century that broke almost every institution it started with, that dissolved empires and overturned hierarchies and unmade certainties that had seemed permanent, she kept her word for 70 years without deviation. The cost of keeping it was paid by a person who did not speak publicly about the paying, but the list of what she never said is there in the silences of the record for anyone who looks. She never said it was too much, she was the queen. Queens do not say that, but the woman who sat alone in the pew with her hands folded in her lap. Watching his coffin, the woman who drove too fast at Balmoral and named the puppies Muick and Sandy, and stood in the drawing room on the 6th of September with her hands bruised and her back straight to receive the 15th Prime Minister of her reign, that woman paid something. Something large and private and irretrievable. She gave it willingly. She believed it was right to give it. She was, in that belief and in that giving, both magnificent and alone in a way that the institution she gave it to was never designed to acknowledge. The crown endures. It always endures, that is what it is built for. She is buried at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, beside Philip, who walked behind her for 54 years of public life and is beside her now. He called her Lilibet, in private, where the institution could not hear. That was what she got to keep. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.